The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. What started as routine parliamentary business turned into the most devastating political demolition in modern British history. Nigel Farage stood at the dispatch box, armed with documents that would send shockwaves through Westminster. Within minutes, Labour MPs were literally fleeing the chamber. Some covered their faces, others refused to make eye contact. And Keir Starmer? The Prime Minister sat frozen, watching his political career crumble in real time. This wasn't just another heated debate. This was a public execution. And the evidence Farage presented was so damning, so utterly devastating, that even seasoned political journalists sat in stunned silence. What you're about to witness is the moment the British establishment realised they could no longer hide the truth. This is the confrontation that will be studied for generations, and it all happened in front of the nation's eyes. The tension in the House of Commons was already thick before Farage even stood up. Labour MPs knew something was coming. You could see it in their body language. The nervous glances, the whispered conversations, the sudden urgent phone calls in the lobby. Word had spread through Westminster like wildfire that Farage had obtained documents, sensitive documents, that would blow apart Labour's carefully constructed narrative on multiple fronts. As the session began, Starmer tried to maintain his usual composed demeanour, but those who know him well could spot the telltale signs. The jaw clenched just a fraction too tight, the fingers gripping the dispatch box slightly harder than necessary. He knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary session. When Farage rose to speak, the chamber fell into an eerie silence. Even the typical parliamentary jeering and background chatter disappeared. He began slowly, methodically, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of barely contained fury. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a hammer blow. He started by reminding everyone of Labour's election promises, the pledges to be transparent, to serve the working class, to restore integrity to British politics. He quoted Starmer's own words back at him, speeches about honesty and accountability. And then, with surgical precision, Farage began to dismantle every single promise. The first revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Farage revealed classified documents showing that Labour ministers had been in secret negotiations with foreign entities, discussions that directly contradicted their public statements to Parliament. The chamber gasped audibly. Opposition MPs leaned forward in their seats. Labour MPs shifted uncomfortably, some already looking toward the exits. Farage didn't pause. He pressed forward, reading excerpts from emails and meeting minutes that showed a pattern of deception at the highest levels of government. These weren't minor policy disagreements. These were deliberate, calculated lies told directly to the British people. Starmer attempted to interject, to claim parliamentary privilege, to shut down the questioning. But the Speaker, sensing the gravity of the moment and the public interest involved, allowed Farage to continue. It was a devastating blow to Labour's attempts to control the narrative. Farage then moved to the economy, another area where Labour had made ground promises. He produced Treasury forecasts that had been deliberately hidden from the public, documents showing that Labour ministers knew their economic policies would lead to disaster but implemented them anyway. The numbers were staggering. Projections of debt levels that would cripple the nation for generations, estimates of job losses that made previous recessions look mild. All of it known, all of it concealed. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted dramatically. What started as typical political theatre had become something far more serious. Senior Labour MPs were visibly sweating. Some were frantically texting, presumably to their advisors or lawyers. Others simply sat in stunned disbelief, realising that years of carefully managed public relations were collapsing in real time. Farage's voice grew stronger as he sensed the momentum shifting completely in his direction. He addressed the millions watching at home, speaking directly to the working families who had trusted Labour with their votes. He reminded them of the promises made on doorsteps, in town halls, in televised debates. Then came the most explosive revelation of all. Farage revealed documents showing that senior Labour officials, including members of Starmer's inner circle, had been involved in schemes that directly enriched themselves while ordinary Britons struggled with the cost of living crisis. The evidence was damning. Bank transfers, property purchases, luxury expenditures, all timed suspiciously close to key policy decisions. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. These were the same people who had campaigned on a platform of economic justice and fairness. The same individuals who had condemned wealth inequality while secretly building their own fortunes. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several Labour backbenchers actually stood up and walked out of the chamber. They couldn't bear to sit there and listen anymore. Some covered their faces with their hands. Others stared at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of their colleagues or the cameras broadcasting this humiliation to the entire nation. Starmer remained seated, his face now pale, his early composure completely shattered. He attempted to take notes to maintain some appearance of control, but his hands were visibly shaking. This was the Prime Minister watching his authority evaporate in real time. Farage wasn't finished. He moved methodically through each scandal, each broken promise, each betrayal of public trust. He spoke about the immigration policies that Labour had promised to address, but instead made worse. He presented statistics showing dramatic increases in illegal border crossings, all while Labour publicly claimed success. He revealed internal memos showing ministers were fully aware of the crisis, but chose political expediency over effective action. The evidence painted a picture of a government more concerned with appearing compassionate than actually solving problems. The human cost was enormous. Communities overwhelmed, public services strained to breaking point, and security concerns ignored. The defence procurement scandal came next. Farage revealed how Labour had cancelled crucial military contracts, leaving Britain's armed forces dangerously under-equipped, while simultaneously approving lucrative deals with companies that had financial ties to Labour donors. The corruption was blatant. National security had been compromised for political donations. Veterans watching from home must have felt sick. The men and women who had served their country betrayed by those they had helped elect. The documents Farage presented showed a paper trail so clear, so undeniable that even Labour's most loyal supporters couldn't dismiss it as political spin. Throughout all of this, the Conservative benches and Reform UK MPs sat in rapt attention, many taking detailed notes, already planning how to use this information in future campaigns. But this wasn't just about political point scoring anymore. This transcended normal parliamentary combat. This was about fundamental questions of governmental integrity and democratic accountability. Even some political commentators who typically defended Labour were posting on social media that this was an unprecedented disaster for the party. The hashtags were already trending. The clips were being shared millions of times. The court of public opinion was rendering its verdict in real time. Farage then addressed the healthcare crisis, another area where Labour had made solemn promises. He revealed suppressed reports showing that Labour's NHS policies were failing catastrophically, with patient outcomes worsening across nearly every metric. Waiting times had increased despite promises to reduce them. Mortality rates for treatable conditions were rising. And all the while, Labour ministers were publicly claiming success. The documents showed they knew the truth. They had the data. They simply chose to lie about it. For anyone watching who had lost a loved one while waiting for treatment or who had suffered through the deteriorating healthcare system, this revelation must have been particularly gut-wrenching. The educational failures came under the spotlight next. Farage presented evidence showing that Labour's education policies, trumpeted as revolutionary, were actually leading to declining standards and increasing inequality. Test scores were falling. Literacy rates among young children were plummeting. Schools in working class areas were being starved of resources while ministers made empty promises. The future of an entire generation was being sacrificed on the altar of political ideology and mismanagement. Teachers' unions, often Labour allies, would find it difficult to defend these revelations. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. As the first phase of Farage's systematic demolition drew to a close, the chamber looked like a battlefield. Labour MPs were scattered, some having left entirely, others huddled in small groups, their faces showing every shade of emotion from anger to despair to utter humiliation. The public gallery was packed with journalists frantically typing on their laptops, trying to keep up with the speed of revelations. This was the political story of the decade unfolding in real time. Starmer remained seated, surrounded by advisors who had rushed to his side, all of them looking equally shell-shocked. The mighty Labour machine, so confident just hours earlier, was being torn apart piece by piece, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Farage paused deliberately, letting the weight of his previous revelations sink into every corner of the chamber. The silence was deafening. He took a sip of water, shuffled his papers with theatrical precision, and then launched into what would become the most personally devastating segment of his assault. This time, he turned his focus directly onto Keir Starmer himself, and the documents he held promised to expose the Prime Minister's personal involvement in the web of deception. The Labour benches, already depleted from the exodus of MPs who couldn't stomach what they were hearing, seemed to brace for impact. Starmer's closest allies positioned themselves protectively around him, but their body language betrayed their fear. They knew what was coming would be catastrophic. Farage began by methodically laying out Starmer's personal timeline, starting from his days as Director of Public Prosecutions. He presented evidence suggesting that even back then, Starmer had made decisions that prioritised political advancement over justice. Cases that should have been pursued were mysteriously dropped. Prosecutions that seemed politically inconvenient were delayed or watered down. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't the impartial legal mind that Starmer had built his reputation on. This was a man who had been playing political games for far longer than anyone realised. Former colleagues in the legal profession would later confirm what Farage was revealing, adding credibility to allegations that would have seemed unthinkable just hours before. Then came the financial bombshell. Farage revealed detailed records of Starmer's personal finances, focusing on property acquisitions and investments that seemed impossible to explain on a public servant's salary. Multiple properties purchased at suspiciously convenient times. Investments in companies that later benefited from government contracts. Transactions routed through complex structures that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The hypocrisy was staggering for a man who had campaigned on transparency and had repeatedly called for others to publish their tax returns. Farage read out the numbers slowly, letting each figure sink in. The amounts were substantial enough to raise serious questions about the source of funds and potential conflicts of interest. The Prime Minister's relationship with various donors came under brutal scrutiny next. Farage presented a comprehensive timeline showing how major Labour donors received preferential treatment, access to ministers, and even policy changes that directly benefited their business interests. The correlation between donations and favourable government decisions was so clear that even the most casual observer could spot the pattern. This was exactly the kind of cronyism that Labour had accused the Conservatives of during the election campaign. Starmer had positioned himself as the antidote to corruption, yet here was evidence suggesting he was deeply embedded in the same system. Several prominent donors would later scramble to distance themselves from Labour as the public backlash intensified. Farage then revealed something that sent genuine shockwaves through Westminster. He produced evidence of secret meetings between Starmer and foreign government officials. Meetings that were never logged in official diaries and never disclosed to Parliament. These weren't casual diplomatic encounters. These were substantive policy discussions about matters of national importance, conducted in complete secrecy and in apparent violation of ministerial codes. The implications were enormous. What was discussed in these meetings? What promises were made? What commitments did Starmer enter into without parliamentary oversight? The questions hung in the air like smoke, and there were no good answers. Foreign policy experts watching would immediately recognise the constitutional crisis these revelations represented. The systematic cover-up that followed was perhaps even more damning than the original transgressions. Farage presented emails and text messages showing senior Labour officials discussing how to hide information, how to mislead journalists, and how to coordinate their messaging to Parliament. This wasn't incompetence or honest mistakes. This was deliberate, coordinated deception at the highest levels of government. The paper trail showed Starmer personally approving strategies to mislead the public and Parliament. His legal training, rather than making him more scrupulous about following rules, had apparently taught him exactly how to bend them without technically breaking them. The cynicism was breathtaking. Labour's response strategy was collapsing in real time. Press officers were attempting to spin the revelations on social media, but their efforts were being drowned out by the sheer volume of evidence and public outrage. Every attempted defence was immediately contradicted by another document Farage would reveal. Every claim of misunderstanding was demolished by clear, unambiguous evidence. The Labour communication machine, usually so effective at controlling narratives, was completely overwhelmed. Their talking points sounded hollow and desperate against the mountain of documentation that Farage had compiled. Political journalists who had spent years covering Westminster were calling this the most comprehensive political demolition they had ever witnessed. The personal toll on Starmer was visible to everyone in the chamber and watching at home. His face had gone from pale to almost grey. His hands gripped the bench in front of him as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Advisers whispered urgently in his ear, but he seemed barely able to register their words. This was a man watching everything he had worked for. Every carefully crafted image, every political calculation crumbling into dust. His eyes, usually so controlled and calculating, now showed something close to panic. Senior Labour MPs sitting near him looked equally devastated, knowing that their own political futures were tied to a leader who was being systematically destroyed before the entire nation. Farage moved to the issue of Labour's handling of the cost of living crisis, an issue that had won them significant support during the election. He revealed internal economic projections that Labour possessed before implementing their policies. Projections that clearly showed their approach would make inflation worse and would disproportionately hurt the working class families they claimed to champion. They knew their energy policies would drive up costs. They knew their economic interventions would fuel inflation. They implemented them anyway, then blamed external factors when the inevitable consequences materialised. The betrayal was complete. People who were struggling to heat their homes or feed their families had been lied to by the very government that promised to help them. The welfare reforms came under scrutiny next, with Farage revealing that Labour had deliberately designed benefit changes to create the illusion of generosity while actually reducing support for the most vulnerable. The mathematics of their policies showed that families in genuine need would receive less assistance, while the government's messaging suggested the opposite. Disabled individuals, pensioners and families with children were all negatively impacted by policies that Labour publicly claimed would help them. The documents showed ministers were explicitly warned about these outcomes but proceeded regardless, prioritising political optics over actual human welfare. Charity organisations that worked with vulnerable populations would later confirm that they had tried to warn Labour about these consequences and were ignored or dismissed. As this section of Farage's presentation concluded, the political landscape had fundamentally shifted. What had begun as another parliamentary session had transformed into a historical moment that would define British politics for years to come. Labour MPs who remained in the chamber sat in various states of shock, anger and despair. Some were clearly calculating their own survival strategies, already thinking about how to distance themselves from Starmer and the party leadership. Others seemed paralysed, unable to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. The Conservative and Reform benches were energised but also somewhat subdued, recognising they were witnessing something bigger than normal political combat. This was about the integrity of British democracy itself, about whether those in power could be held accountable for systematic deception. The answer, it seemed, was finally yes. The chamber remained in a state of barely controlled chaos as Farage prepared to deliver what many would later describe as the knockout blow. The documents he had presented so far were devastating, but what came next would cement this parliamentary session as a watershed moment in British political history. He shifted his focus to what he called the systematic betrayal of British sovereignty and national interest. Allegations so serious that they touched upon fundamental questions about who actually governed the country. The remaining Labour MPs looked like prisoners awaiting sentencing, their faces reflecting the grim realisation that there was more to come and no escape route available. Starmer had given up any pretense of composure, his legendary courtroom poker face completely abandoned as he stared blankly ahead. Farage began by exposing Labour's secret agreements with international organisations and foreign powers that effectively surrendered British decision-making authority on critical issues. He produced copies of memorandums of understanding that had never been presented to Parliament, agreements that bound Britain to policies that voters had explicitly rejected. These weren't minor administrative matters. These were fundamental issues of trade, immigration and regulatory alignment that directly contradicted Labour's manifesto promises. The documents showed that within weeks of taking office, Labour had begun negotiating away British sovereignty in exchange for political cover and favourable treatment from international bodies. The betrayal cut to the very heart of democratic accountability. Voters had chosen one direction and their elected government had immediately begun pursuing the opposite. The immigration revelations became even more explosive. Farage presented evidence showing that Labour had actively worked to undermine border security while publicly claiming to strengthen it. Internal Home Office documents revealed deliberate policies to reduce enforcement, decrease detention capacity and limit deportations, all while ministers stood at the dispatch box and promised the opposite. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of illegal immigrants who should have been detained were instead released into communities across Britain. Removal orders that should have been enforced were quietly cancelled. And throughout all of this, Labour ministers gave interviews claiming they were taking a tough stance on illegal immigration. The gaslighting was comprehensive and systematic. The national security implications were perhaps the most chilling aspect of Farage's revelations. He presented intelligence briefings that had been delivered to Starmer and senior ministers, briefings that warned of specific threats to British citizens and interests. Despite these warnings, Labour had reduced funding for counter-terrorism operations, cut intelligence service budgets and weakened surveillance capabilities. The documents showed that these decisions were made for political reasons, to appeal to certain voter demographics and activist groups, despite explicit warnings from security professionals that lives would be put at risk. Former military and intelligence officials watching this unfold would later speak publicly about their horror at seeing their warnings ignored for political expediency. Farage then turned to Labour's energy policies, which had been marketed as green and progressive, but which the documents revealed to be economically catastrophic and strategically foolish. Internal assessments showed that Labour's rush to shut down reliable energy sources while becoming dependent on imports would leave Britain vulnerable to foreign pressure and would drive energy costs to unsustainable levels. Ministers knew this, they had the projections, they understood that their policies would result in blackouts, price spikes and increased dependence on hostile foreign powers. They proceeded anyway, prioritising their environmental credentials over energy security and affordability. Families who had seen their energy bills triple had been assured these increases were unavoidable, when in fact they were the direct and predictable result of deliberate policy choices. The corruption in public procurement extended far beyond what had been initially revealed. Farage presented case after case of government contracts awarded to companies with clear Labour connections, often without proper competitive bidding processes. The contracts were vastly overpriced, the services delivered were substandard, and the taxpayer footed the bill for what was essentially institutionalised theft. Billions of pounds that should have gone to improving public services had instead lined the pockets of Labour cronies and donors. The audit trail showed deliberate circumvention of procurement rules, with civil servants who raised concerns being sidelined or silenced. This wasn't incompetence or bureaucratic inefficiency. This was organised corruption operating at scale with the full knowledge and participation of senior ministers. The education system revelations became even more damning when Farage revealed Labour's deliberate manipulation of standards and testing to hide the catastrophic failure of their policies. Schools were pressured to inflate grades. Tests were made easier while ministers claimed standards were rising. Achievement gaps between privileged and disadvantaged students were widening, yet Labour's manipulated statistics suggested the opposite. Parents who trusted their children's education to the state system had been systematically deceived about the quality of schooling being provided. Teachers who attempted to speak out about declining standards were threatened with disciplinary action or blacklisted from promotion. The entire system had become corrupted by political imperatives that prioritised good headlines over genuine educational outcomes. The NHS crisis reached new depths of scandal when Farage revealed that Labour had diverted healthcare funding intended for frontline services into politically motivated vanity projects and administrative bloat. Hospitals desperately needing equipment were denied resources, while money flowed to diversity consultants and rebranding exercises. Waiting lists grew longer, while administrators multiplied. Clinical staff faced impossible workloads, while bureaucrats received bonuses for meeting targets that had nothing to do with patient care. Internal NHS reports had screamed warnings about declining care quality and rising preventable deaths. These reports were suppressed, their authors intimidated into silence. The human cost was measured in lives lost and suffering prolonged, all to protect Labour's political narrative about NHS improvement. The housing crisis, another key electoral issue, had been deliberately exacerbated by Labour policies despite their promises to solve it. Farage presented evidence showing that Labour had blocked housing developments in areas where new residents might vote Conservative, while approving low-quality developments in Labour strongholds regardless of local opposition. Planning regulations were weaponised for political advantage rather than to ensure good outcomes for communities. Young families desperate to buy homes had been sacrificed to electoral calculations. The documents showed ministers explicitly discussing housing policy in terms of voting patterns rather than housing need. The cynicism was complete. Even the fundamental human need for shelter had been subordinated to partisan political advantage. As Farage systematically demolished what remained of Labour's credibility, the wider implications became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about one political party's failures. This was about a crisis of governance that raised fundamental questions about accountability in British democracy. How had this systematic deception been allowed to continue for so long? Where were the checks and balances that should have prevented such abuses? Why had the media, the civil service, and other institutions failed to expose what was happening? The documents Farage presented suggested that the rot went deeper than just Labour, that there were systemic failures across multiple institutions that had enabled this corruption to flourish. The British establishment would never be viewed the same way again after this day. The Labour benches were now almost empty, with only the most loyal or shell-shocked MPs remaining. Those who stayed looked broken, their political careers and reputations destroyed by association with a scandal of this magnitude. Starmer sat motionless, a man who had built his entire image on integrity and competence, now exposed as complicit in systematic deception and potential corruption. His political obituary was being written in real time, broadcast to millions of viewers who felt betrayed and furious. The reckoning had arrived, and there would be no escape from the consequences of what had been revealed.